Okay, welcome back. Hour number 3 tonight. Dr. Henry Niman is here with us again as we have planned this hour and a half special on Friday to try to keep at least somewhat apace with what's going on. I'm going to read a very short piece from the New York Post, which is a good paper. I think what they put out is often quite credible. It's entitled Whistleblower Doctors, and these are doctors in Wuhan, according to the story, say that coronavirus reinfection is real and even deadlier than the first go-round. So what they're saying is you don't have conferred immunity if you survive it. You can still become infected again, and it's much worse. Chinese doctors sounding the alarm on the coronavirus say the illness could be even deadlier for patients who catch it again. This according to a new report. The whistleblowing physicians working to fight the virus in Wuhan, the epicenter of the outbreak, revealed that medically cleared patients have been getting reinfected. This reported by the Taiwan News. Here's a quote now. It's highly possible to get infected a second time, end quote, said one of the doctors who declined to be identified. He told that to the Taiwan News. The physician said that medication used to treat the virus can have negative side effects on patients' heart tissue, making them more susceptible to cardiac arrest. Well, whether it's medication or a second round of the virus, I think you can just kind of flip a coin. They're using, I guess, antiretrovirals, HIV medications on some people, and I think that's what the doctor's alluding to. A few people recovered from the first time they were infected by virtue of their own immune systems, but the meds they use are damaging their heart tissue, and when they get it a second time, the antibodies in the body don't help, but makes it worse, and they die a sudden death from heart failure. The doctor added that the virus has, quote, outsmarted all of us, end quote, since he says it's able to hide symptoms for up to 24 days, which contradicts current guidance that the incubation period is 14 days. What's more, the infected patients often return false negatives before eventually being diagnosed with the illness. Now, here's the kicker. It can fool the test kit. There were cases that they found that the CAT scan, the CT scan, shows both lungs are fully infected, but the tests came back negative, PCR tests, 4 times. The 5th test came back positive. So that's very concerning. All right, we have much on the table here, Henry. Go right ahead.
Okay. Well, actually, one of the things they asked about it at WHO was the use of steroids to treat the patients, and WHO didn't really come out and say that was a bad idea, but they kind of suggested that it might be, and I'm not sure if the steroid use has to do with any of those additional medical issues. There's also some data on antibodies, especially if the strain changes, that the antibodies against one strain may not be that effective at inhibiting the other strain, but it may facilitate the other strain entering the cells via the antibodies binding to the virus and getting the virus into the cell more easily. And there was that type of phenomenon for dengue, and that led some of the vaccine resistance because they were vaccinated against one strain of dengue and it gave protection, but then that left them vulnerable to another strain. And then some groups just kind of extrapolated that to all vaccines and argued that they shouldn't be taking any vaccines for anything. But there has been a paper that's in press that actually shows that type of antibody-enhanced infection for coronavirus. and that may have some bearing on the report that you just read. And there clearly are videos of people suddenly dying in Wuhan, and the argument there was that it was the antibodies, or not the antibodies, the virus was attacking the heart, and that was leading to sudden death. And
there are only a couple of pieces that discuss the virus targeting other areas of the body, like the digestive tract, the heart, the brain. They always talk about lungs and pneumonia, but apparently it can overwhelm other major sectors of the physiology.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, there do seem to be, that's what I was saying with the viral load, and in areas where there's a lot of virus, there seems to be more complications as far as the severity of the disease, as well as the deaths. And so the deaths were part of what happened with WHO in Iran. That did seem to signal a major change, at least in the reporters' eyes, because after the presentation is made, then they're open for questions from the reporters, and there were a couple that were zeroing in on Iran and questioning whether the window was closing or the window was closed. When they pushed and said, "Well, what are you going to do if the window is closed?" and they said they were going to fall back on, scientists and the various approaches that were in development as far as drugs to treat it or vaccines, although vaccines are like a year away. But they'd be using, modern techniques to try to, give some assistance to the battle against the virus itself. And but there was definitely a sense from the WHO that the Iran outbreak had taken everybody by surprise, and B, probably more because the deaths were already known. I mean, I had a report that I sent yesterday that indicated that there were 9 deaths already, and then another report had 2 more that didn't include those 9, so it said there were 11 deaths already. And, so they were kind of getting over, very concerned when there were 4 deaths, that there were 11 deaths, which very well may be, and that might get confirmed the next day or two. Then the argument will be that there's even more viruses circulating there. And the concern is that it'll spread very easily from in the Middle East. And actually the real concern is that it already has spread in the Middle East. And, they really weren't testing people that came from Iran. They were testing people that came from China. And it may really have zipped in under the radar, especially if there's a lot of traffic with pilgrims going to these mass gatherings.
Oh, yeah.
And coming in and out, they would seed all those countries that are adjacent to Iran with infected pilgrims, and that's probably what happened in Lebanon, where they had 1 confirmed and 2 suspects, so they may have 3 cases, whereas yesterday they had 0. So these would be the first 3 cases, and they would all be from the same city in Iran. And the test kits have, just recently gone out. So, had these same people appeared 3-4 weeks ago, they really wouldn't have even had the kit to do the test. And so, there wouldn't be any likelihood, it would be a very low likelihood that they would be detected. So Iran had a significant effect on the WHO meeting. And then a few hours later, the CDC had called a teleconference. And the CDC teleconference was focused on the cruise ships, and they put out a statement from the Department of State essentially saying that this rescue that was done for the Diamond Princess was an exception. That travelers shouldn't assume that if they go on a cruise ship and get into a similar situation that the U.S. is going to send planes and rescue them. They really need to be aware of the fact that they could get stranded on a cruiser, and so they issued that alert, and then they mentioned that there was travel warnings to Japan and I think Hong Kong. It might have been South Korea now. I'll get to South Korea, but South Korea has gotten out of control by the hour, and based upon a super story. Well, since I mentioned it, we might as well skip to it. I mean, I had told you yesterday that it was up to 200 confirmed cases, and the last you had seen was 100. Well, there are reports today that's up to 346. So, and
142 new infections.
Right. And so it's most of them seem to be associated with a super spreader at this church service that may involve thousands of people, and they're doing the same type of thing where they're basically calling off Easter gatherings and shutting down schools and shutting down shops and kind of closing things up in the general area in South Korea, and so that's another indication that A, there's a super spreader, B, that it's getting a lot of people, and C, that some of the people are in severe condition. So speaking of severe conditions,
the industrial impact is already being felt there. Samsung closing down some operations at least. This is bringing these countries to their knees, and Korea appears to be right in the crosshairs.
Right, and the same things happen with Japan. I mean, I'm sorry, with Iran, they are talking of essentially shutting down the town where the pilgrimage is. I think there's
QOM. It's a holy city there.
Right.
I think.
And so that's a concern. And then they were also moving paramedics into Tehran because of outbreaks there, and trying to get that under control. And
when the big pilgrimage is to the Hajj, they call it the Hajj. That's where you got that you mentioned earlier. That's July 28th. So
and that's down in Saudi Arabia, though. So how much activity there'll be. It sounds like there'll be a lot more damage before it ever get around to that. Because it sounds like Iran is in serious trouble if there's outbreaks in all of these cities. And like I said, there's probably cases throughout the Middle East already, and they just haven't realized it because they didn't have the kits, and they really weren't thinking that if they have somebody with atypical pneumonia, they figure that it's atypical pneummonia from something else because they haven't been to China. But these are in Iran. It's community spread for sure, and it sounds like there's a lot of cases, but it also sounds like it might have just suddenly exploded. That they gave another death. It was a doctor, I believe, who was in the hospital bed. So they had pictures of him alive, and I think they were
it was a doctor
yesterday, and that he died since that. So some of these cases have just died, and so it may be that it's getting to that level where it was kind of under the radar. They were pneumonia cases, some were admitted in the hospital, and then recently some of them started deteriorate and die, and that kind of set off one alarm bell, and then these other reports started coming out indicating that they were widespread. So
how about this
they
one?
did mention how about
10 towns in northern Italy are now on full lockdown.
Yeah, that's the other super spreader, and you were kind of jumping ahead a little bit. But
sorry.
This is a 38-year-old, and and indeed, I think there's 15 or 16 people that he's infected, including, I think, 5 or 8 healthcare workers at the hospital where he was treated. And, that sounds an awful lot like the super spreaders from SARS that got things rolling. And, it's not clear these sequences from these super spreaders. The milder one, the sequence was out, one of the sequences in France from the businessman that got infected in Singapore. But in that case, it was a lot of people that were identified, but they were all either very mild or asymptomatic. I mean, he was asymptomatic, and the only reason that cluster was identified is because he had heard that there was a case at the meeting that he was at, and then that got him to go to the doctor, and then he was diagnosed. And but he was at most he had a mild case. Maybe by the time he got back to England, he had a mild case, but most of the time when he was in the meetings in Singapore as well as in France, he was asymptomatic. And when these other people that got infected were with him, and when he met up with them in France, they became infected. And I'm pretty certain he was still asymptomatic then. So he would be a good example that the virus can transmit and can transmit to quite a few people, but they kind of have a milder version, and that the sequence wasn't that remarkable when it was released from one of the. It wasn't from him; it was actually from one of the people that was infected in France. But some of these other super spreaders is really not out yet, so it's not really clear if there's anything unusual about the virus in South Korea or the virus in Iran. And the Iran situation just seems that it's more mature. It's not that you just have people that are infected and the first cases are appearing. Mm-hmm. There are cases that are dying and other cases that are
it sounds like
anyway
they were really keeping a lid on this for some time while it continued to.
Yeah, because that's what everybody expects as soon as you hear that the first 2 cases are deaths. And I mean, the same thing would happen with like H5N1. That it was like you didn't hear about anybody hospitalized and then dying. The first thing you heard was that they had just died. And that's usually an indication that surveillance is either very bad or not very forthcoming or transparent, that they knew they had cases, but they really weren't telling anybody. But in any event, going to the CDC, the CDC called it because of the cruise line situation. And they announced that they were going to change the way they report the cases in the U.S. now. So that was news, but that wasn't from a question. That was what they were planning on saying at the conference. And
how so? How are they going to change the way they report the cases? You either have a case or you don't.
Well, yeah, but you've got a case in the United States, or you've got a case on a cruise ship or in an evacuation. So they're essentially saying that the cases that they evacuated from Wuhan and the cases that they evacuated from the Diamond Princess would be their own category. So they would keep tabs on those. And
70 in California infected.
And they would be in one group, right? And then they would have the ones that were infected in the United States. That would be the second group. So on their website, they do have them split up that way, and they have 18 right now is what they have listed from the cruise ship, and another 3 from Wuhan. So they've got 21 cases that are in the United States, but infected elsewhere and brought to the United States by the chartered airlines. And then they have what's the number? I think the number is 14 now in the United States, because they took away the two that were in Southern California and the one that was in Texas, because those came from the evacuations of Wuhan, and so they're just dividing them up. They think the ones in the U.S. better represent the case situation in the U.S., whereas the other ones represent Americans that were infected elsewhere. And they didn't even say what they're doing with the Americans that are like in Japan. I mean, they would be another category where they were identified as being positives in Japan are being treated in Japan. So they're Americans, and eventually they're going to come back to the United States. But for right now, they're in hospitals throughout, or in some cases, apparently hospitals, because they don't have room for them yet in the hospital.
Right.
They will move into that.
Did CDC in its press conference today, Henry, mention the issue of the defective test kits?
Yeah. The kits came up also. The plan, number one was to distribute the kits, and they said that they were still undergoing evaluations, and sometimes they run into these types of validation issues, but that they were still testing them at the CDC and the in Atlanta, and that those samples don't have a backlog, so they're really not running into a delay, that they test them as soon as they receive them. And so, I mean, there's a delay in the time it takes to pack it up and put an overnight shipment. But once
Here's
it gets to Atlanta, they process it right away.
Did they mention this? And this is a news story from Politico. Problems with a coronavirus test developed by the CDC have delayed the Trump administration's efforts, the CDC's efforts, to expand screening to state and local public health labs. More than 2 weeks after the FDA granted permission to distribute the CDC test kits nationwide. Here's the kicker. Only 3 of the more than 100 public health labs across the country have verified the CDC test kits for use. This according to the Association of Public Health Labs. So 3 out of over 100 say that the kits are good and they'll work. And then I got this story from Hawaii, which says that, hold on, where did it go? This is another important one. Well, basically it said that the word from Hawaii is virtually nothing. Why? Because they aren't testing people in Hawaii. Why? Because they have no tests to give them.
Right.
So Hawaii is screwed.
Well, they can. I don't know how much longer the shipping is because they're further out, but they can pack them up and send them to Atlanta, and they'll get tested. It's not as convenient, and there's a shipping delay to get them from point A to point B. But yeah, the idea of the kits where it is going to be easier for the local labs to do it, and they basically have a validation test, so they have to take the kits and they're given samples, and they have to be able to reproducibly identify positives as being positives and negatives as being negatives, and so they have to have some predetermined accuracy in using the kits, and once they demonstrate that proficiency, then they are accredited to actually do the testing on their own. And apparently there was a problem with one of the tests, and a lot of or it sounds like most of the labs failed because that test didn't give consistent results, and so they're kind of back to the drawing board and giving them a new set of kits. And then as far as the screening by the CDC announced that they were going to be doing surveillance to look for community transmission by taking advantage of the network they have for influenza, and they providing kits there. And they announced that last week, but they were asked where that stood, or were those in place, and they said, well, the kits are there, but they're going to start doing the screenings next week. So they're not really doing the surveillance at those 5 cities yet for picking up the COVID and people that have flu-like symptoms but are negative on the flu test.
The bigger story here for me, and just in terms of Hawaii, they've got no test kits, they've got no ability to screen, and that one hot case they had was there for 7 to 10 days on Maui and then on Waikiki. They're not able to test anyone. They don't know what's going on in Hawaii.
And he's already infected at least 2 and probably more than that in Japan after he returned. Mm-hmm. So he was a hot one. Well, there they've got a kit. So yeah, he definitely has contacts that are positive in Japan, including his wife. His wife is positive, and she wasn't symptomatic while they were in Hawaii. And so the chances are that her infection is due to him. And so she's positive, and then there's a couple other acquaintances of his that are positive, and one of hers that is positive. So the virus that the 2 of them have, assuming it's likely that his wife is infected with the same virus he has, that virus has infected a minimum of 3 people in Japan and probably more than that. And whether they've infected people in Hawaii, is an open question, because he was symptomatic while he was there, and he did wear a mask on the plane, but he was.
Here's the Star Advertiser in Honolulu, February the 21st. Headline: No one in Hawaii has been tested for coronavirus as health officials wait for kits from the CDC. They're running blind there. They may have dozens of cases. They don't know.
Right. I mean, they still have the option of taking a sample and sending it to the CDC for testing. So, I mean, they have that. With Hawaii, it would be less convenient than other countries or other states, because it would be a longer distance to ship it. Although I don't know how big a difference that makes. It might make like a day.
FedEx overnight is pretty good.
The hard part is getting the samples and packing it up and shipping it out. And Hawaii might be a slightly longer delay.
When they do get their kits, they're going to be in for a rude surprise. There's a lot of Chinese and Japanese there.
Well, that's the general issue, is that, and that's part of the reason they are planning on doing this community surveillance, because they simply haven't been testing those people. They were initially doing Wuhan, and then I think they might have expanded it somewhat to cover all of China. But in the meantime, there's community transmission in multiple countries now. Not even if you throw Iran out, which is brand new, but there's lots of cases, like there's over 300 now in South Korea. All of the recent cases in Hong Kong have been local transmission. Virtually all of the recent cases in Japan have been. So has Singapore. So all of those countries would be sending people to the United States, and the number of positives there. the number of lab-confirmed cases is just, the tip of the iceberg on any of these countries. Right. It's not like everybody's getting picked up and being tested. There are people that are asymptomatic. They have no idea that they have the virus, and others are mildly affected. Go ahead.
This another important one. This has to do with people allegedly voluntarily self-quarantining themselves and then turning up infected later. I have a real problem believing a lot of that these people just suddenly decide to self-quarantine after they've returned, say, here from China. One person came from China on February the 2nd, and then on the 21st they announced that the person is infected. All right. So here's another story, though. We talked about this. The comedian who was booked to work as entertainment on the Westerdam, he decided he didn't want to stay in the 5-star hotel for the quarantine, so he snuck out, got on a plane, flew all the way back to SeaTac, I guess took another plane down to Eugene, and he's back home. And he pronounced himself uninfected and said he was tested, but no, there's no proof of it. So this guy's walking around the community, and the local public health people, apparently, I don't know what they've done or not done, but they certainly haven't put him under quarantine or curtailed him. This guy could easily be another potential spreader. We just don't know. We don't have the tests. We don't have the kits.
Well, they were done in Cambodia, and they did have the test. That's how they got the one positive. But it's not clear how big a deal that is, because to my knowledge, there haven't been any other positives announced, and so they would have. I know they intercepted like 185 U.S. citizens that were planning on getting on a plane, and I think they didn't get on the plane. And I'm virtually positive that they won't be allowed on a plane until they, at a minimum, have been tested. And I would think that by now, some or
and then we got the damn story
would have been tested. If anybody was positive, that would have been news. So
we got the story from Wuhan, though, that bothers me too. I don't know how you feel about it professionally, but if somebody can be a false negative on 4 PCR tests, and then they run a CAT scan and his lungs are loaded with virus, and then he's finally positive on the 5th test, what does that tell us about? Were these flawed tests that he was given? I don't know. We don't know. They're unanswered questions.
No, I mean, there is some evidence for that. And the question is when that was done. Because the whistleblower had that happen. That he died like last week or so. And he went through multiple negative tests before he was finally positive. I don't recall the exact number, but it wasn't 1 or 2. It was like 3 or 4. And that again may have to do with the timing of that, because if you recall, when the outbreak started in Wuhan, they initially had 59 positives, but that was based on clinical presentation. And then once they had the kit, the number went down to 41, and then they basically left it at 41 for a while, so it was kind of unchanged, and people were asking, if there's so much activity there, how can there be no new cases? And at that time, there were a few exported cases, so it was kind of like, well, how are they showing up in Singapore or South Korea? Or Japan, I think it was Japan and Singapore, and it wasn't Singapore, it was Thailand. So they were showing up in Thailand and Japan as being positive and coming from Wuhan, and Wuhan was still stuck at 41. And they said they were waiting for a more robust test. So they were indirectly saying that they didn't have a whole lot of confidence in the test.
Yes, that's
that they
exactly
were using, and they were waiting for a better one. But it's not clear that when they had it in Wuhan, whether they had it for everybody in Wuhan. So they may have had a limited number of tests that they were initially, looking for more people that were linked to the seafood market, and not really doing a whole lot of testing beyond that. And this physician had said that it was at least 3, possibly 4 or 5 tests that were negative before he finally got a positive. I mean, he knew he was infected with that virus, and he couldn't, prove it with the test because the test kept on coming up negative. So, what they're reporting in that, I mean, the reports that show up in local media like that really come from scientific something. It's more from, if it's not written up scientifically, it's from somebody that is giving anecdotal kind of reports from the front lines, and there could be a significant delay. So these multiple negatives may have been something that was happening in January, and late December, January timeframe, and that might have just been not so much something unusual with the patient, but maybe the test still they didn't have the robust version yet, and they kept trying because they knew that this person was positive based upon his lungs, and they just figured, well, if they do X, Y, or Z, they can get a positive, and they weren't successful. And whether they were taking samples from different sites, and because sometimes what happens is if they're very sick, then that could be at a time where they've been infected long enough that they've cleared the virus from their upper respiratory tract, and you really need to have some type of bronchial lavage or something along those lines, where you're getting fluid right out of the lungs. Mm-hmm. And so they could conceivably be negative multiple times because they were really sampling the upper respiratory tract. So when they do that, they get a negative. The lungs are positive because that's where the virus is, in the lungs. And if they're not drawing samples from the lungs, or if they have technical issues on getting a good sample from the lung, they could conceivably have negatives. I mean, I ran into that personally with H1N1, that I took my daughter and I knew she was positive. And
you had it. You had it twice, as I remember.
Right. And I actually, when I took her in, I didn't have it yet. I actually got it the next day when went to the soccer game, because she wasn't there, and I do the stats. So I was there, and this mother, actually, she was a doctor of another patient. She was, coughing away, and I said, "What do you think you got?" And I don't know. I got whatever my daughter's got. I said, "What do you think she's got?" And she says, "I don't know." I said, "Well, I think she's got swine flu. I think half of the team has swine flu, including my daughter." And she says, "Well." So I just went to the point. Well, how are you treating it? Oh, we're taking Tamiflu. So she knew what she had, and I knew what she had. And but the point was that when I was talking to the doctor, when I brought my daughter in, I said, "Well, she's got the classical symptoms. Half of her soccer team has the virus. A lot of the kids are out of school already, and I'm sure she has swine flu." And he said, "Well, I'm not so sure. We just had, I don't know, some five cases, and there were classical swine flu, and we took the nasopharyngeal swabs on them, and they were all negative." And they have some type of upper respiratory infection. And I said, "I think you just got a swabbing issue," and that didn't go over that big, but I'm sure that was the case. That would have been an example where whoever was doing the swabbing just was not getting a good sample. and they were getting false negatives. Because I'm sure those 5 that had classical swine flu symptoms in October in Pittsburgh, in our area, were definitely swine flu. That there was no way that they were getting 5 negatives. It just happened to have some upper respiratory tract infection when they ended up following up with serological testing before the vaccine came out, so they could still test for antibodies. And 40% of the samples collected from high school age students that were collected before the vaccine came out were positive for swine flu antibodies. So it was, and that's not necessarily going to be able to pick up everybody that actually had been exposed. Their antibody levels could still be below detection and still have been affected. So the bottom line was that they were testing people that definitely had H1N1, and the test definitely worked if they got a good sample. But if they had a technician that wasn't used to taking nasopharyngeal swabs, they could have come up with negatives. And it's conceivable you could add something like that with this, with COVID, because I'm sure these places were overwhelmed, and they may have been short on technicians, and somebody might have been collecting samples that didn't have that much experience collecting samples, or maybe had experience, but the experience was collecting it improperly, and so they were generating these negatives. And they finally got somebody that knew how to do a swab, and then they got a positive. So that's one of the problems with testing. That there's a lot of ways you can get a false negative, and in some cases, like what I had seen here in Pittsburgh, I'm virtually positive it was as simple as the technique to get the nasopharyngeal swab, because you actually have to go pretty deep. But on top of that, if somebody was very sick and the lungs were full of virus, they could very well have cleared the virus from their upper respiratory tract, and if they could get a good sample, a good lung sample, then fluid from the lungs, that they would get a positive. But if they were still trying to detect the virus in their upper respiratory tract, they could be getting a negative. So some of this could be the test, some of it could be the technique, and some of it could be where the virus was and where they were, what kind of samples they were collecting, and those are a lot of variables to try to figure it out. But the idea that somebody that was very sick and had a lot of virus in their lower respiratory tract but was testing negative is not a new story. That's happened with swine flu, and that I'm sure it happens with SARS, and it happened with COVID also. That if you're not sampling where the virus is, you're going to get negative, even though the person has the virus.
We got just 5 minutes left. Let me ask you to do this now. Let's just pull back. Let's just rewind this thing and pull back a little bit and look at America. Look at the U.S. We've got a big Chinese community in Vancouver, British Columbia. Obviously, one in Seattle. There's a smaller one in Portland. There's a big one in San Francisco. There's a very large one in L.A. And yet none of those, which would seem to me to be obvious targets to look at, none of those seem to be reporting any active infections. And I'm wondering out loud if those communities are so tightly knit that they know they've got people sick, and they know there's nothing that a hospital can really do, so they're keeping them in their own communities quietly at home, wherever they are, and not saying anything. I told you that I have a friend in San Gabriel, which is 80% Chinese. He said all the Chinese are wearing masks all the time. Right. And it would just suggest to me that they know something that the world doesn't about. They got people coming and going all the time to China, or they did.
Right, but I mean that's why they'd be wearing masks. They don't have to know somebody is definitely positive, but they know.
That's right. Now, that's true. But it's a possibility.
And in China, everybody's wearing masks. So I'm sure that their relatives in China say, "Well, you got to wear a mask." Everybody's wearing a mask here, and
I don't have an answer. I just know there are a lot of Chinese and no cases.
They could say exactly what you're saying, which is people come and go all the time. And there's definitely virus here, and it's all over China, and there's almost certainly people coming in. But that's some of the under surveillance type stuff that, you cited how many people were under self quarantine and under
almost 6,000 in California, I think. Yeah.
Right. And that's what that surveillance is for.
I would think so.
Really people that have come from China that they tell them to, essentially,
voluntary
quarantine, and to take their temperature on a regular basis, and
which can mean nothing.
I think they call in or they're called, and that's the surveillance they're under. They basically are recording their temperature on a regular basis. Now the problem with that, of course, is that you can have the virus and not have a temperature. I mean, that's what these asymptomatic cases are.
That's right.
That's what they were doing on the Diamond Princess. The main symptom they were looking for, I think, was fever, because the Abels both had a cough, and they had a very pronounced cough, and they were not tested for that cough, and the personnel there, the medical personnel, were aware of it, at least, as long as what he said on the video was accurate. He said that, they had medical personnel call on them and say they heard that they weren't feeling that well, and they interviewed him, and they heard him coughing. I mean, they couldn't go more than a minute without coughing. So, I mean, they were constantly coughing. And they would have, medical personnel would have picked up on a cough and say, well, how long have you had this cough, and how frequent is it? And unless they lied, they would have said, well, we've had the cough for 3, 4, 5 days. It was over a long period of time. I saw the videos.
Yes, it was.
And they were never tested.
I'm afraid.
They were only tested when it was their turn, when they started testing the 70-year-olds who were theoretically asymptomatic. That's when they came by and collected a sample from both of them. And that was at the very end of the testing process. So their criteria for, being a concern is a fever. And in fact, I think it wasn't just a fever. I think they had to be 1 degree centigrade above normal, which is about 2 degrees above normal Fahrenheit, for them to be considered to have a temperature. And the same thing happened with H1N1. I mean, there were 50% of the H1N1 cases didn't have a fever. I mean, when I had H1N1, I think I got up to 100 overnight. I had a night sweat that night, and my temperature was normal in the morning. So I had a temperature for less than 12 hours, and I was lab confirmed. I mean, I definitely had the virus, but
right.
About half of the people didn't have a fever. So in any event, they were using this to monitor, and it could very well be that that's what they're using on the home quarantine. They're asking what the temperature is. They can have people that are infected and don't have a fever, and in fact don't have anything. They're asymptomatic and they've got the virus. And so, that's why a lot of this airport screening and this monitoring is not, the ideal way to find community spread. And that's the reason they've switched over to these 5 locations. But unfortunately, unless I misunderstood the transcript will be up later tonight, and I'll reread it. But I'm pretty sure that they said they have not started the surveillance until next week. That was one of the questions that they were asked, and so and then on top of that, they were also asked about the Diamond Princess and positive cases, and they said they expected to have a number of additional positives over what they have now.
All right, so we're out of time basically, but real quick, what do we expect here? A story to break tomorrow, the next day?
There were 2 new cases in Northern California, one yesterday and one today in Humboldt County and in Sacramento County. So they are getting cases regularly. The one in Humboldt County was community, and I think that the numbers are going to start to increase because there's just too many other countries now. So people can be coming from South Korea or from Singapore
a couple of weeks,
Hong Kong.
2-3 weeks until the panic hits, if things go according to what they look like they're going to go.
Yeah, I think it turned the corner today with Iran. That everybody knows that there's going to be one case after the other in the Middle East.
10 towns in Italy locked down.
And then you got and so it seems that we're getting more into the super spreaders stage. I don't know if that means the virus has changed yet. The virus sequences that have been made available so far really don't show anything dramatic. But this is when it happened in with SARS, that the big change is 29 nucleotide deletion. It was first identified in the cases out of the Metropole Hotel, and frankly, it was all the cases after that were international. They all had the same mutation.
Okay.
So,
all right.
We'll see.
Henry? We will see. Thank you for another great week of reports. We'll have a lot to report Monday with Henry when he comes back, and through the week. This is apparently poised.
It's going to accelerate as far as the development. Yeah, right. So I think there'll be a lot of news next week.
All right.
Okay. Have a good weekend and talk to you.
Thank you. Okay, Henry. Good night.
Okay. Take care.
All right. And thanks to all of you for being here. I hope you found these programs helpful. I don't know where else you can get some of the information we have here. It's just as good as I can imagine it being, and just great work by Henry and Yoshi and Dick Allgaier, for that matter, and his viewers. All right. Plan ahead. Prepare now. Think about it this weekend. What are you going to do to get some food put away? You need to make those decisions. All right. Talk soon. Take care.